This is Professor Ludlum. This is the Law of International Business Transactions, LS 4533. Today we're looking at Chapter 17, Protection of Intellectual Property in International Business. Now, what do we mean by intellectual property? Again, it's not just that your goods are being copied or duplicated, but you may also want to sell the right to produce your goods, right? Grant a license for them to produce your goods in a foreign country. It also involves sharing of technology, sharing of trade secrets, secret recipe, technology aspects, software code, all these kind of things, and sharing them abroad in a way that both allows you to sell goods abroad and protect your interests domestically. One of them that you're probably very familiar with is ICANN, that deals with computer domain name dispute resolutions. Copyrights, all originated at the Berne Convention. The idea is that every country has to have minimum substantive laws. The problem is, what's going to be the minimum? And by default, the rules of the United States and the European Union end up being the standard minimum, because those are the two big markets for intellectual property where you want to sell most of your goods. Regardless of where they're produced, you want to be able to sell your goods in America and in Western Europe. And as a result, obeying their laws ends up being the worldwide norm for a minimum. TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property agreements, are one of the international agreements that we've made to standardize or attempt to standardize the intellectual property protections you have of goods throughout the world. I'll give you an example of it. One of which that's become fairly standard is a 20-year protection on patents. What's interesting is what's America's protection on patents? 20 years. See what I mean about the default becomes America, because America has that as a minimum. If you instead set up the international guide as 10 years, maybe America doesn't want to sign on to the agreement, and then you can't sell goods in the American market. And so it ends up America's defines or sets the goals for the world dealing with intellectual property. One unique area, again, because of the responsive world crisis, is our protection for pharmaceuticals. Up until January 2016, we're freely allowing least developed countries to be exempt from providing patent protection for pharmaceuticals. In other words, if you're a manufacturer of medicine in a least developed country, you can openly violate the patent protections. You can basically buy medicine, figure out how it's made, and using that, use their ideas and create your own medicine, sell it in your own country without violating any kind of treaties. We're doing this primarily because of the AIDS crisis in Africa and in Asia, and these least developed countries can't afford the basic pharmaceuticals that are very, very expensive when they're produced in the West. And as a result, we're letting them openly violate the patent and intellectual property agreement so that they can survive this kind of global crisis. Another area where we're having difficulties with intellectual property, this is part of the Doha agenda, is geographic indicators. In other words, is the name of the good something that implies it comes from a very specific region? One of which has been constantly litigated over and over again, is Champagne. Champagne is actually a region in France. And so the argument of the French companies are that any product that uses the word Champagne has to be made in France because Champagne is a region of France. And if you'll notice, next time you're at a liquor store, the stuff we call Champagne, if you read the bottle and if it's produced in America, it actually says it's sparkling wine in the fine print. It doesn't call it champagne, even though it's side by side and tastes the same, looks the same, all those kind of things. You cannot use the word champagne because that indicates it's from France. Give you a little quiz here. What's not the yellow state, but the one right above it? That's Kentucky. Well, Kentucky whiskey. Does Kentucky whiskey have to be made in Kentucky? Well, if you're the governor of Kentucky, yes, it does. That's geographic restrictions. The name of the good implies it's produced physically in Kentucky. Now, what Kentucky whiskey really is sour mash. It's basically a process of producing whiskey that it could be made anywhere on earth. But because we call it Kentucky whiskey, should it be restricted to just those companies that are physically located in Kentucky? And again, that's one of our geographic indicators. As opposed to KFC. KFC can restrict their good. Why? Because KFC doesn't describe the good, it describes the company. Kentucky Fried Chicken is not the product. Kentucky Fried Chicken is the company, the moniker that indicates the producer. Whereas Kentucky bourbon is a type of product like champagne. Or for my more globally inclined students, I guess I could ask what the country is to be more general, but what is that specific region? That's Italy. What is that specific region the area is pointing to? That's the Parma region. That is where Parmesan cheese comes from. In fact, the Parmesan just means it's from the Parma region. And again, it's a very unique style of cheese. Has a unique taste, unique method of production, fermentation, all those kind of things. Does Parmesan cheese have to be from the Parma region in order to call itself Parmesan cheese? Or can we just say Parmesan means it tastes like that kind of cheese? And again, if you're Italy from the Parma region, of course it's got to be made there in order to use the name. But if you're more one of the American consumer groups, you probably think, well, no, that's just a name that indicates a certain kind of taste of cheese that could be produced anywhere. These are the ideas of the global production. Or, for example, tequila. I know none of you know what that is, but it's an alcoholic beverage. Tequila, for it to use that name, has to be produced in Mexico because that's the only place that tequila technically can be made. Again, it's made out of agave plants, but the process and the final product is something unique to Mexico. Now, literally, we could probably produce the same goods in another country that has the same climate and those kinds of things. But again, it's like champagne. It's a geographic indicator of the goods. If it's named tequila, it has to be a Mexican company. What are some of the problems dealing with intellectual property? It's very difficult to enforce. It's not just a political problem of they don't want to enforce it. It's a problem of how do you enforce it. If you're an American company and a company located in Spain is violating your copyright, how do you force the company in Spain to stop? Practically, it's a very difficult thing. You can go to Spain and sue the company. Can you complain to the American government and expect the American government to fix it? Could you complain to Spain's government and expect them to respond to a foreigner's request? Again, the enforcement of these agreements are very difficult, and that's why we need to have the international treaties that provide for a level of enforcement.